Hey everybody. Um, this is the section from a chapter in Iring Fetscher's Marx and Marxism. The chapter is titled "The Relationship of Marxism to Hegel." I've already read the introduction, and now I'm going to read the first section of the piece. The reason I'm breaking these sections down is this chapter is very long and will not make a very appetizing YouTube video if it's 4 hours long. So, or more. So I'm breaking it down. So, this section is titled Fundamental Aspects of the Relationship Between Marx and Hegel. Footnote. On this point, the extensive analysis by Karl Löwit in Von Hegel zu Nietzsche, der revolutionäre Bruch im Denken des 19. Jahrhunderts, which is in English is from Hegel to Nietzsche. Also Ludwig Landgreb's Hegel und Marx in Marxismus-Studien, and also, quote, Das Problem der Dialektik in the same volume. And the introduction by Siegfried Landshut in Karl Marx Die Frühschriften. The books by Georg Lukács and Karl Korsch referred to below, as well as the essays by Herbert Marcuse, his detailed criticism of Marx's Paris manuscripts in Die Gesellschaft, Volume 9, Berlin, 1932, and Marcuse's book Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Social Theory, inaugurated the current interpretation dominant in the West of Marxism from the early writings of Marx. So, end footnote. There are two areas central to his entire theory. There are two areas central to his entire theory in which Karl Marx was a student of Hegel and also criticized and continued Hegel's work: the philosophy of history and anthropology. The doctrine of the ideal community, which corresponds to the, quote, essence of man, end quote, is, however, closely related to the field of anthropology. The, quote, dialectical method, end quote, which has the unique characteristic that the dialectical method cannot be isolated from the dialectical method's, quote, object, was not taken over by Marx as an abstract instrument, but studied with reference to the dialectical method's applicability to the areas mentioned above, and also with a view to determining the extent to which the dialectical method could be applied rationally. Finally, the dialectical method was used for an analysis of the economic structure of society. In order to clarify this relationship, it is necessary to examine both areas briefly. Marx agrees with Hegel on a number of essential assumptions concerning the philosophy of history. Both see an objective reason in the historical process. Hegel formulates this as a basic assumption in his philosophy of history, whereas Marx takes the assumption as being self-evident. Quote, the only thought which philosophy, Iring Fetscher, and bracket, introduces is a simple thought of reason, the notion that reason rules the world, that is, that world history has also been determined by reason, end quote. Marx. Hegel, excuse me. However, this objective reason in the historical process does not achieve the satisfactory state of existence for man, which comes of the end of the process of development in a straight and continuous line, but by dialectical means, that is, with the help of negative elements and phases, which viewed in isolation contain unhappiness, want, and distress, that is, quote, unreasonable, end quote, elements which nevertheless fulfill a, quote, reasonable, end quote, necessary and rational function as aspects of the general process. Aspects of the general process. For example, Hegel justifies the existence of wars by the statement that wars elevate the community of the state to a higher level and help to overcome the tendency towards the isolation of the individual and towards egotism. In a similar manner, Marx justifies the epoch of capitalism because in spite of the distress and misery of the proletariat, the boundless urge to profit leads to an enormous increase in productivity, which will one day provide the basis for the overthrow of capitalist society. The negative factor is justified because the negative factor leads beyond the present imperfect state and therefore, quote, negates, end quote, the negative factor's self. However, whereas for Hegel, the Weltgeist, God, is the subject of a historical process which is moving towards a, quote, adequate consciousness, end quote, as mankind develops, so that the ultimate significance of history is theological. In the case of Marx, the Weltgeist is replaced by human society. The Weltgeist is replaced by human society, which is only gradually becoming united. For Marx, therefore, the meaning of history is purely human, but in this way the guaranteed meaning which Hegel sought to give to the speculative theological framework of his system is lost. Just as the Hegelian Weltgeist, quote, makes use, end quote, of the individual, quote, national spirits, end quote, to advance step by step along the path of development, mankind, though this expression can be used only metaphorically when speaking of Marx, makes use of the major classes, which become, as it were, the vehicles for historical process at a given level in the development of society. In Hegel's system, world history approaches world history's culmination in the German Christian national spirit. The German Christian national spirit. For Marx, this culmination is reached in the revolutionary action, revolutionary praxis of the proletariat, and the creation of a classless society. A decisive difference is immediately apparent here, whereas Hegel believed that philosophy always appears only when, quote, a form of life becomes senile, end quote, preface to the philosophy of right, so that an understanding of history and an interpretation of history's meaning can be arrived at only after the event, a definitively correct philosophy of history being possible only when history is, quote, completed, end quote, and no longer brings anything essentially new. Marx believed that the decisive step towards completion of the development of mankind could be taken by a conscious decision, understood and rationally planned in advance. Footnote. It is not possible in this context to examine in detail the, quote, precursors, end quote, to whom Marx could refer in this transformation of Hegel's philosophy of history. The most important is the Polish Hegelian August von Kiszkowski, with his Prolegomena sur Historiosophy of 1838. Kiszkowski, I don't know how to say his name, already mentions that after the appearance of Hegel's latest philosophical works, there is no longer any need for humanity to suffer humanity's history blindly, for humanity has, quote, reached a state of maturity, end quote, in which, quote, its own provisions are entirely identical with the divine plans of providence, and, to the extent that individuals in world history, are no longer to be blind tools, either of chance or of necessity, but conscious masters of their own freedom, end quote. In a series of new formulations, Kiszkowski announces in his short work the, quote, practical implementation of philosophy, end quote, and opines, quote, the absolute idealism of Hegel has achieved all that it is possible for philosophy to achieve, and if there is anything missing from philosophy, that is a defect in philosophy itself, and a limitation of the philosophical sphere, end quote. Kiszkowski. Future philosophy will, however, be the, quote, passage of philosophy beyond philosophy's self, end quote. Quote, we announce a new epoch for philosophy as such, in which, even though it leaves behind its most essential element and position, philosophy will nevertheless represent the progress of the spirit, ... Philosophy must therefore now be content primarily with being applied, and just as the poetry of art has been transformed into the prose of thought, so philosophy must descend from the heights of theory into the battlefield of practice. Practical philosophy, or to put it more accurately, the philosophy of practice, the most concrete action of life and social conditions, the development of truth in concrete activity, is the future lot of philosophy as such. End quote. Kishkovsky. Following on Kishkovsky, it was above all Moses Hess who expressed the orientation of Hegel's philosophy of history to the future and its conversion into practice. In his Ural Pesha Archi, 1841, for example, Moses Hess writes, quote, if philosophy is unable to return to dogmatism, it must progress beyond itself to action in order to arrive at positive achievements. The philosophy of action differs from the previous philosophy of history in that it is no longer concerned merely with the past and present, but on the basis of these two factors draws the future into the realm of speculation. End quote. Hess's idea of a synthesis of the practical French and the theoretical German spirit is new, even though socialist ideas already appear in Kishkovsky. Fourier in particular is mentioned. Hess was the first to determine the close links between the philosophy of action and practice and socialism. Marx, of course, adds the systematic notion of the collective spirit of historical action, the proletariat. End footnote. German Wikipedia says August Kishkovsky. I guess I should look that up on Polish to English. Polish to English.
August Cieszkowski. August Cieszkowski.
August Cieszkowski.
August Cieszkowski.
Cieszkowski.
August Cieszkowski. August Cieszkowski.
Cieszkowski. August Cieszkowski lived from 1814 to 1894, was a Polish philosopher of history, economist, and political activist. Kishkovsky was a follower of Hegel's philosophy, later broke away from it, and finally developed a, quote, Christological worldview, end quote. It says, Kishkovsky divides world history into three epochs. In the pre-Christian era, the will dominates thought. In the epoch from Jesus to Hegel, thought dominates the will. It is only after Hegel that idealism develops. Now philosophy becomes aware of the Christian will. This is no longer just a, quote, branch offshoot of epistemological activity, end quote, Kishkovsky, end quote, Kishkovsky, but has a nature of its own. In the epoch after Hegel, the Holy Spirit rules in a, quote, Third Reich, end quote. He demands of the Slavs to build a Christian brotherly world, otherwise a time of false, quote, Third Reich, end quote, threatens. Alright. I don't know what any of that means, but I had to look him up. And I'm going to assume, and I feel like I know enough about Moses Hess where it's not necessary for me personally to look him up. Anyway, end footnote. Who am I talking about? Marx contrasts a purely passive subsequent understanding of the reasons behind history with the awakening awareness of the revolutionary class of the proletariat, which is translated into action. Marx's philosophy of history therefore goes beyond that of Hegel in two respects. Not only the past but the future is accessible and can be interpreted by human reason, while instead of mere passive understanding, action can also be taken with a full awareness of its extent and significance. According to Hegel, an adequate state of awareness of the, quote, substance, end quote, of history, which is also history's subject, is reached in Hegel himself at the end of the progression through different national spirits. What the Weltgeist reaches in Hegel after the completion of Hegel's work is the highest idea of his philosophy. According to Marx, the, quote, substance, end quote, of history, namely mankind in a constant state of change, reaches a state of awareness at the end of mankind's prehistory, which corresponds to what we understand by history, and on the basis of this awareness, revolutionary action, the, quote, revolutionary praxis, end quote, of which there is now for the first time an awareness ensues. Mankind therefore takes control through this revolutionary action by the, quote, class of mankind, end quote, an expression which might well be used based on Fichte's, quote, nation of mankind, end quote. While mankind was previously ruled by an objective historical process which was beyond its control, it now becomes the master of the conditions governing its own existence. Mankind assumes completely sovereign power. It can now therefore, quote, make history real, end quote, and shape history freely according to its own ends, while according to Marx, the Hegelian Weltgeist was the subject of history only in Hegel's imagination, because in reality it appeared after the event as a conscious spirit and was then projected back into the past by the speculative philosopher. The decisive step beyond Hegel, therefore, consists in replacing a subsequent awareness of the meaning of past history by a conscious shaping of future history, which will be achieved by the proletarian revolution. In philosophical terms, Marx is not deviated from Hegel, but is simply given a practical revolutionary turn to Hegel's thought. Historically, Hegel's philosophy can be considered as an ideal justification of the French Revolution of Napoleon, as was the conclusion first of Heinrich Heine, and after him of Marx. Heinrich Heine was an important German Jewish poet. Footnote. Heinrich Heine zur Geschichte der Religion und Philosophie in Deutschland, which I think means the history of religion and philosophy in Germany. Book 3, von Kant bis Hegel. I think that might mean from Kant to Hegel. See also the essay by Wolfgang Harrich, Heinrich Heine und das Schulgeheimnis der deutschen Philosophie, end quote, in Sinn und Form, Volume 8. A comprehensive presentation of the whole theme of the relationship between Hegel and the French Revolution, with a detailed bibliography, will be found in Joachim Ritter's lecture Hegel und die Französische Revolution. Let's see if Joachim Ritter is someone I should know. The significance of Napoleon for Hegel is the central point of Alexander Kojèv's, I don't know if it's Alexander Kojèv's, interpretation of the phenomenology of spirit. If you don't know who Kojève is, he's like an important Hegelian in the mid-20th century France. Moses Hess has dismissed Heine's analogy and stated in this connection that, quote, only Kant and Robespierre ... are similar phenomena. However, German philosophy, the positive development of the freedom of the spirit, has so little in common with the future experiments of French politics that ... it takes all the imagination of a poet to find analogies here. But all the more important is the analogy, indeed the fundamental identity between German philosophy and French social philosophy, which already liberated itself from the school concepts after Saint-Simon and Fourier and began to penetrate into the nation as scientific communism, end quote. And Moses Hess. Where am I? Okay, there's a very long footnote. Where am I? Come on. Son of a gun. Come on. Okay. End footnote. On the other hand, Marx's theory of history is not aimed at the justification of a past revolution, but at the preparation of the revolution of the future. The same dialectical structure of thought is used in one case apologetically and in the other in a revolutionary manner. This is made possible by the essential ambivalence of dialectical thought. However, this, quote, categorization, end quote, of Hegel in the actual historical context must not overlook the fact that Hegel's thought, against the background of German misery and backwardness, was extraordinarily, quote, advanced, end quote. For example, his philosophy of law lists a whole range of legal institutions which were still lacking in Prussia at the time. Footnote. This was shown in detail by Eric Weil in his little book Hegel et l'État, which I think is Hegel and the State. Wolfgang Harrick has also drawn attention to this point in his afterwards prohibited contribution to the discussion of the relationship between Hegel and Marx. D.F. Strauss is, as far as I can see, the first to have significantly defended Hegel against the criticism of having glorified Prussia. In his critique of Jung Deutscher Apostate Wolfgang Menzel, D.F. Strauss writes, quote, "But again, anyone who has read Hegel's philosophy of right will be aware that much of its essential content has a structure different from that of the Prussian state. Jury courts are demanded, which exist in only one province in Prussia. Corporations are made a basic pillar of state life, but corporations have been abolished in Russia. The two-chamber system is stated to be the correct system, but there is none in the Prussia. Council discussions are required to take place in public, and this doesn't happen in Prussia. And princely power is far more restricted than is the case in the state of Prussia. If Herr Menzel had only read ... Hegel's Württemberg Landtag of 1815 and 1816, Herr Menzel would surely be ashamed to define as servile a man whom our liberals should study to learn the meaning of liberalism," end quote. And that's D.F. Strauss, right? So end footnote. Moreover, if Hegel first praised the revolutionary state of Napoleon and later the reformed Prussia of Stein-Hardenberg as the, quote, reality of the rational, end quote, in Hegel's age, this need not be explained as an accommodation based on considerations of expediency, but also has some justification in view of the Bourbon reaction in France. The reference to, the Stein-Hardenberg, if you look it up, if you type in Stein-Hardenberg reform on Wikipedia, takes you to a page called Prussian Reform Movement. So let's see what is said here. The Prussian Reform Movement was a series of constitutional, administrative, social, and economic reforms early in 19th century Prussia. They're sometimes known as the Stein-Hardenberg reforms, for Karl Freiherr vom Stein and Karl August von Hardenberg their main initiators. German historians such as Heinrich von Treitschke saw the reforms as the first step towards the unification of Germany and the foundation of the German Empire before the First World War. Isn't Heinrich von Treitschke like the extreme nationalist? Yep, extreme nationalist. Knew it. Okay. The reforms were a reaction to the defeat of the Prussians by Napoleon I at the Battle of Jena Auerstedt in 1806, leading to the Second Treaty of Tilsit, in which Prussia lost about half its territory and was forced to make massive tribute payments to the First French Empire. To make these payments, it needed to rationalize its administration, bracket, clarification needed, end bracket, that's from Wikipedia. To become a great power again, Prussia initiated reforms from 1807 onwards based on Enlightenment ideas in line with reforms in other European nations. They led to the reorganization of Prussia's government and administration and changes in Prussia's agricultural trade regulations, including the abolition of serfdom and allowing peasants to become landowners. In industry, the reforms aimed to encourage competition by suppressing the monopoly of guilds. Administration was decentralized and the power of Prussian nobility reduced. There were also parallel military reforms by Gerhard von Scharnhorst, August Neidhart von Gneisenau, and Hermann von Boyen, and educational reforms headed by Wilhelm von Humboldt. Gneisenau made it clear that all these reforms were part of a single program when he stated that Prussia had to put its foundations in, quote, the three-faced primacy of arms, knowledge, and the Constitution, end quote. It is hard to ascertain when the reforms ended. In the fields of the Constitution and internal politics in particular, the year 1819 marked a turning point, with Restoration tendencies gaining the upper hand over constitutional tendencies. Though the reforms undoubtedly modernized Prussia, the reform's successes were mixed, with results that were against the reformers' original wishes. The agricultural reforms freed some peasants, but the liberalization of landholding condemned many of them to poverty. The Prussian nobility saw its privileges reduced, but the Prussian nobility's overall position reinforced. Very interesting. Where am I? Moreover, Hegel first praised the revolutionary state of Napoleon and later the reformed Prussia of Stein-Hardenberg as the, quote, reality of the rational, end quote, in his age. This need not be explained as an accommodation based on considerations of expediency, but also has some justification in view of the Bourbon reaction in France. If Hegel wished to show the reality of the reasonable, Hegel could not make a state which had already vanished, that is, which was now unreal, the Napoleonic state, the object of his demonstration of this fact, but had to turn to the most advanced existing state of his age, and this was certainly Prussia after the reforms, at least in continental Europe. Although Hegel lived to see the July Revolution, only his followers reacted to this event and to the growing conservatism in Prussia with a new orientation towards France. We do not need to examine in this context why Marx replaced the attention to nations in history with the consideration of classes. Marx arrived at his concept of the significance of the class structure for an understanding of the historical process through contemporary French historians to whom he makes specific reference. See, for example, his letter to Wiedemeyer of the March 5th, 1852, and also through the classical English national economy. What Marx added was a combination of both theories, the doctrine of the appearance of politically relevant classes from the development of the mode of production in society, and their derivation from the economic structure, which again is dialectically linked with the state of technical advance. We do not need to examine these considerations in detail here, since we are simply concerned with outlining the relationship between Hegel and Marx. However, they do take on a certain measure of significance because Hegel had already studied the classical English national economy, above all Smith and Stuart, and incorporated their thought in his philosophy of right. Georg Lukács therefore proposed the thesis that the dialectical thought of Hegel owes the dialectical thought of Hegel's origin to the philosopher's concern, Hegel's concern, with the two great real dialectical processes of his age. The French Revolution and the modern capitalistic form of production in England, as reflected in the theories of Smith, it would then follow that when Karl Marx applied this dialectic thought of Hegel to an analysis of the economy, Marx was using a method which derived originally from the observation and penetration of the same area of reality, a hypothesis which explains both the fertility and usefulness of the method. There's a footnote here. Georg Lukács der junge Hegel über die Beziehungen von Dialektik und Ökonomie, which I think is it's titled The Young Hegel. I don't know what the other parts is. I don't know what the other words mean. As well as Lukács' disciple Fritz Behrens. Hegel's ökonomische Auffassungen und Anschauungen in this site der Karl Marx Universität Leipzig, 1952 to 53. I believe Leipzig was in East Germany, or what was East Germany. Wikipedia says Fritz Behrens is a German politician of the SPD. I don't think this is who I'm talking about. Wikipedia says Friedrich Behrens. Friedrich Franz Willy Fritz, quote Fritz, end quote, Behrens, lived from 1909 to 1980 and was one of the leading economists and one of the main representatives of the new economic system in the GDR. I'm trying to look through to find like the thing that's most relevant to what I'm saying here. Okay, and there's nothing really that it's particularly relevant to what's being read, what I'm reading now, so. Marx's continuation of Hegel's anthropology is almost as important as his links with the latter's philosophy of history. Commentators generally draw attention only to the influence of Feuerbach, who was certainly of some importance for Marx in his rejection of Hegel's spiritualism, but commentators forget to examine the extent to which the Marxian image of man and his essential structure is already present in Hegel. Again, this is not simply a case of Marx, quote, taking over, end quote, Hegel's ideas, but an example of a real transformation and development, the extent of which can, however, be understood fully only against the background of Hegel's doctrine of man. Hegel, like Marx, understands man as a being who must make himself what he is. This process of humanization of man by man is placed by Hegel in a speculative theological framework and then appears as the elevation of man, who initially exists in purely animal terms, to the absolute spirit. And because in the last resort all reality originates from the spirit and is therefore spirit, quote, in quote, its otherness, end quote. This elevation represents a return of the spirit into the spirit's own. What then appears to be the work of man, progressive spiritualization and realization of the spirituality of all reality through theology and absolute knowledge, is in reality the work of the absolute spirit which comes into its own again in man. However, if we remove this speculative framework, quote, work, end quote, appears, quote, as the essence, the self-ascertaining essence of man, end quote. Marx. It is only in work and through work that man, quote, ascertains, end quote, according to Hegel, his natural superiority, that is, his humanity, equal to spirituality. The essence of work lies in the fact that a man shapes for his own ends the limited section of nature which is within man's grasp, thus negating its qualitative form, and instead gives it a form which originates from the human will and has been planned within his head. From the outset, Hegel associated this humanizing process with a given social situation. Only the slave, the man who is dependent on a master whom he fears, seems to him willing and able to suppress his natural appetites based on the consumption of natural products so to such an extent that he renounces immediate satisfaction and simply works the object. Footnote. Father Gaston Fetscher, S.J., has detected the basic error of the Marxist concept in the disregarding of the political aspect of this primary model of social dialectics and has contrasted the fascist isolation of the political power, government, with the Marxist isolation of the economic aspect, labor, as the complementary extreme. It has been shown that one extreme could change into the other, e.g. in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Only in Hegel do we find full consideration of concrete reality. See J. Fetscher, France prend garde de perdre ta liberté, 1946, and par de la le fascisme et le communisme. Wikipedia says that Gaston Fetscher was a French Jesuit and theologian. End footnote. And this form of work does not in the first instance embody his own idea, but that of his master. Work, according to Hegel's definition, is, quote, postponed greed, end quote, delayed satisfaction. But according to Hegel, the working slave does not remain static at this stage of development. The sight of what he has achieved helps him gradually to an awareness of his superiority above nature and hence to a consciousness of his humanity and freedom, which hitherto appeared to be represented solely by the sovereign master. Sooner or later, the slave will then feel that his slavery is incompatible with his humanity and seek to discard it so that he can make himself free externally in terms of social relationships. The master who has become dependent on the service of his slave and is unable on his own to dominate nature cannot in the long run resist the urge of his working slave towards emancipation. In somewhat simplified terms, is the content of the famous chapter on, quote, master and slavery, end quote, in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Marx did not see human work as originating in principle from the social situation of the slave. It seemed to him to be originally a, quote, freely creative, end quote, activity of individuals. I cannot examine here the question of the extent to which Hegel revealed deeper insight than Marx, and to which his concept of the origin of work, which leads to culture, but is based on suppression, that is, slavery, is confirmed by Freud's philosophy of culture. Footnote, it is characteristic of Marxist studies that the only concrete examination of this problem was made by a German scholar resident in the USA, whereas not even the basic problems are discussed in the Soviet Union. See Herbert Marcuse, Eros and Civilization, published in Boston, 1955. End footnote. It is simply important to note that Hegel is of the opinion that work need not always be performed in the state of dependence which was originally characteristic of work. For him, the prerequisite for liberation lies in the spiritualization of man, the voluntary and independent suppression of man's animal nature, which is brought about by the habit of work, that is, by the continued repression of the sensual desire. Here we have Hegel's basic notion of the liberation of man through spiritualization, a liberation which is rejected by Marx as purely imaginary. Footnote. In Anti-Iring, Friedrich Engels admittedly writes at one point as though in referring to ideal freedom, he, like Hegel, were speaking of the dominion of, quote, spiritual, end quote, human existence over human existence's sensual nature. Quote, freedom, therefore, consists in the control over ourselves and external nature, which is based on a knowledge of natural necessities, end quote. Friedrich Engels, Anti-Iring. The, quote, we, end quote, which takes precedence here over the, quote, us, end quote, can only properly be interpreted as a moral spiritual self in which the parenthesis blind, question mark, and parenthesis natural drives of the biological creature man are subjected. End footnote. It is, however, worth emphasizing once again the coincidence between the two anthropological assumptions. For Hegel and for Marx alike, man is a being who realizes his own potential, who turns himself by his own activity into a man. This self-realization, which is also, quote, spiritualization, end quote, in Hegel, is achieved for both these thinkers through work. It is only through work that man reaches an awareness and becomes conscious in himself of his own humanity. Only after he has objectified himself in a product of work can he reach a recognition of his specific human nature by considering this product his special natural superiority and freedom, as Marx would say, or his spirituality in Hegel's sense. Man is the objective being, das gegenständliche Wesen, Marx. The being which must first objectify that being's self before the being, that being can become that being's self and come fully into that being's own. Man is at the same time the only animal capable of entering into an objective relation with man's own species. Man as an individual relates himself to the species which he, quote, has, end quote, at the same time, quote, in himself, end quote, as language, thought, etc. After emphasizing this decisive coincidence of ideas, we must, however, also consider the essential critical distance which arises between Marx and Hegel. We have already indicated this difference briefly. Marx does not accept Hegel's identification of man with the, quote, subjective spirit, end quote. For Marx, man is a creature of flesh and blood and cannot be reduced to mere spirituality, which is only one of man's characteristics. Only one of man's characteristics. The act of working on an object, therefore, does not save the sense, as it does for Hegel, of showing that everything is spirit, that there is no, quote, strangeness, end quote, between the working individual and the object which the individual works, because both are cancelled out in the higher unity of the dialectical process of the spirit, Geist. Working of the object serves rather to enable man to appropriate nature, to humanize an essentially, quote, alien, end quote, nature, which thereby becomes a source of culture and a home for man. The major difference between Hegel and Marx does not lie in the fact that Hegel sees the highest form of work in purely intellectual, spiritual mastering, interpretation of reality, while Marx is primarily thinking of concrete physical work, but that Hegel seeks a different purpose in work, even in material work, from Marx. Hegel sees work as a means to spiritualize man through the ascetic factor which it entails, and as a means to reveal the spiritual structure of nature, by demonstrating the meaninglessness of the external aspect of its form, which first is opposed to consciousness, while Marx views work as a means for man to appropriate and humanize nature. In Capital, Marx provides the most detailed and concrete description of the essence of human work, which I should like to cite here in extenso, so as to show that this is by no means a statement of young, quote, non-Marxist, end quote, thought, which has to be revised by Marx in later years. Quote, labor is in the first place a process in which both man and nature participate, in which man of his own accord starts, regulates, and controls the material reactions between himself and nature. Man opposes himself to nature as one of his own forces, an aspect that Hegel overlooks, an aspect that Hegel overlooks, Iring Fetscher, setting in motion arms and legs, head and hands, the natural forces of his body in order to appropriate nature's productions in a form adapted to his own wants. By thus acting on the external world and changing the external world, man at the same time changes his own nature, the humanization of man, Iring Fetscher, man develops his slumbering powers and compels his slumbering powers to act in obedience to man's way. We are not now dealing with those primitive instinctive forms of labor that remind us of the mere animal. An immeasurable interval of time separates the state of things in which a man brings his labor powers to market for sale as a commodity from the state in which human labor was still in its first instinctive stage, Hegel, on the other hand, would not call these instinctive activities, quote, labor, end quote, because these instinctive activities lack the specific character of suppressing a desire and hence spiritualizing the worker. To what extent he is completely logical in showing the origins of work as being linked with the development of a state of mastery in slavery. To that extent, he is completely logical in showing the origins of work as being linked with the development of a state of mastery in slavery. Iring Fetscher, back to Marx. We presuppose labor in a form that stamps it as exclusively human. A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of the spider's cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of the bee's cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before the architect erects his structure in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer in its commencement, in that labor process's commencement. The laborer not only expects a change of form in the material in which the laborer works, but the laborer also realizes a purpose of his own that gives the law to his modus operandi, and to which he must subordinate his will. End quote. Das Kapital. In contrast to Hegel, Marx therefore emphasizes the fact that labor, even intellectual work, always has a natural material side, which is not pure creation independent of the basic material, but the conversion and assimilation of nature. In his marginal notes on the Gotha program, Marx emphasized once again this dependence of human work on nature. Quote, labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is as much the source of use values, of which material wealth certainly consists, Iring Fetscher, as work which is itself only the expression of a natural force. Human labor, A socialist program must not allow such bourgeois turns of speech, as, quote, labor is the source of all wealth, end quote, Iring Fetscher, to pass over in silence the conditions which can alone give meaning to such expressions. And to the extent that man adopts from the outset the attitude of an owner towards nature, the original source of all means and objects of labor, and treats nature as his property, his labor will become the source of use values, that is, of wealth. The bourgeois have a very good reason to endow labor with a fictitious supernatural creative power, since it follows from the dependence of labor on nature that man who has no other property than his labor must be the slave of others in all social and cultural states, that is, of other men who have made themselves the owners of the objective conditions of labor, end quote, Marx. However, not only work, but the human appropriation of the objectified substances as well as conscious material act. It is not enough to recognize the spirituality, or in Marxist terms, the humanity of the product of labor or culture, to appropriate it as a human being. The appropriation is effected with all the senses developed and cultivated by the history of the humanization of man. It is a many-sided conscious appropriation, just as the production is fully conscious Unlike the specialized unconscious production of animals, the human being who for Marx as for Hegel is a worker and producer can therefore be free according to Marx only when he is able to work freely and freely appropriate the products of his own work. Simple abolition of the legal rights and privileges of the quote masters end quote is not sufficient because it allows the dependence of men who have no possessions on the owners of the means of production to continue. The servant who has political freedom is still unfree as a human being in bourgeois society. The servant who has political freedom cannot dispose freely of nature and the instruments of production as the indispensable tools of his trade, nor can the servant who has political freedom appropriate freely the product of social work. Marx uses the Hegelian term alienation to describe the consequence of this relationship of dependence. The worker, and man is essentially a worker, cannot acquire his product which stands in a relationship of strangeness and hostility to him. His product belongs to another. The worker cannot therefore conceive of his work as a free expression of that worker's humanity. On the contrary, it seems to him to be, quote, slave labor, end quote, which material need forces him to perform, even if in legal terms he is completely, quote, free, end quote. He therefore alienates himself in the last resort from his own humanity because work, the specific characteristic of man, becomes a mere means to eke out a physical, that is, subhuman animal existence. Footnote. On this point, see Erwin Metzger, Mensch und Geschichte im ursprünglichen Ansatz des Marxischen Denkens. End quote. And I think that means men and history in I don't know what, in Marxist thought. That's from Marxismus Studien 2. 2 again, 1957. End footnote. Where am I? To sum up, both for Marx and Hegel, work is the essence of man, but while Hegel expects work to lead to the spiritualization of man and already perceives freedom in the spiritual appropriation of reality by the human consciousness, Marx emphasizes the inevitable material side to all work. Work is possible only when man is the owner of a part of nature or when it is left to him by the actual power. Humanization of man by modified nature which has become culture, is possible only when man can appropriate all the products of his labor and enjoy them with all his senses. Labor itself, like the appropriation of labor's products, is therefore dependent on the relationship of property. The worker who has no property cannot work when and as he likes, nor can the worker who has no property appropriate for himself the object of his work. The worker who has no property is therefore alienated from the product of his labor and from the actual process of labor, which the worker who has no property, with the worker who has no properties, alienation from the actual process of labor and the product of his labor. Sorry, I'm getting all kinds of confused here. The worker who has no property is therefore alienated from the product of his labor and from the actual process of labor. With his alienation from the actual process of labor, the worker who has no property also alienates himself from his own free humanity. This different concept of the meaning and conditions of humanizing work also leads to a different notion of the ideal order of human community. Hegel's ideal community is a free state, the state whose citizens willingly accept the common will expressed in the laws because it is, quote, spirit of their spirit, end quote, because their own reasonable and general will can be found and recognized in its law. If this thought is formalized to a sufficient extent, it can be used to justify any form of government. Hegel, however, was convinced that the reasonable form of order in the state had been achieved in the constitutional monarchy, which was the objective of the Prussian reforms, and that every reasonable and intelligent person would be able to reconcile himself with this reality. Footnote. Strictly speaking, the term, quote, ideal, end quote, should not be used in connection with Hegel or Marx. According to Marx and Hegel's philosophy of history, an ideal which is isolated from the process as a whole is a completely empty and meaningless postulate. Marx and Hegel are only concerned with recognition of the valuable, reasonable aim towards which history is, quote, necessarily, end quote, moving thanks to its innate dynamic trend. End footnote. However, it is if the citizens of Hegel's state, Hegel, however, was convinced that the reasonable form of order in the state had been achieved in the constitutional monarchy, which is the objective of the Prussian reforms, and that every reasonable and intelligent person would be able to reconcile himself with this reality. However, if the citizens of Hegel's state are to be, quote, free, end quote, it is essential for them to become spiritualized, to assert the identity of their own will with a deeper common will which is contained within them. In short, the spiritualized citizens identify themselves with the spirit of the existing constitution and are therefore free. However, this democratic spiritualism is moderated considerably by the manner in which Hegel then presents the detailed aspects of this spiritualization and allocates and justifies a certain degree of freedom to the physical individuals. In civil society, the, quote, system of needs, end quote. Marx's criticism is directed, however, in the first instance against Hegel's spiritualistic principle. Marx was not able to reconcile the notion of liberation through spiritualization with Marx's own image of mankind. It seemed to Marx as illusory as the notion of humanization through spiritualizing work and the accompanying ascetic demands. Men can be free in the concrete sense only when men are no longer required to elevate themselves to the level of abstract citizenship of the state in order to accept the community willingly, when they are able to develop freely in and through the community as real physical individuals. They can be free only if the common interest is no longer alienated from them and expressed in the form of the laws of the state. Marx calls the community in which such general concrete freedom of all individuals will be possible the, quote, classless society, end quote. Only when all men have become joint possessors of nature and thus have, quote, subsumed under themselves, end quote, the condition of their work can each individual become a, quote, communal being, end quote, Gemeinwesen, and be free, quote, in and through society, end quote. The identification of the spiritualized citizen with the objective spirit of the Constitution is surpassed by the conscious unification of real men with this community in the classless society. However, what I have just defined as the, quote, ideal of the community, end quote, is not presented by Marx as an ideal demand with ethical foundations. Marx tends rather to be convinced that the trends in the development of the capitalist society which Marx examined in his economic works, especially in Capital, are leading toward the establishment of such a state. Marx's philosophy of history, supported and continued in his critique of political economy, systematically replaces the moral appeal of the, quote, utopian socialist, end quote. On the other hand, this, quote, foundation of the philosophy of history, end quote, must not be imagined as though Marx were intending to describe an automatic process which we simply have to observe passively. Marx tended rather to see the decisive significance of historical development in the appearance of the proletariat. The appearance of the proletariat as a special class which tends to become the vast majority of society and within which the community of interest defeats all conflicts of interest so that these interests are consciously united in the solidarity of a community and can become the conscious collective subject. The conscious collective subject of the revolution on the basis of this unity. The dialectical process therefore consists here of the following three decisive points. 1. The development of the proletariat on the one hand resulting from the objective reason which is immanent in the historical process and of modern industrial production with its possibility of meeting the needs of everyone on the other. 2. The growth of self-awareness within this proletariat, and 3. The, quote, revolutionary praxis, end quote, of the proletarian revolution and the subsequent conscious process of historical planning into which the process of class awareness transcends. There is therefore a double dialectical transformation. 1. The transformation of the objective situation into the awareness of this situation and of its significance, the process of developing awareness in the proletariat. And 2. The transformation of this self-awareness into revolutionary practice, a material and objective process. Marx hoped to promote the first transformation through his numerous speeches and published works by propagating an awareness of the meaning of the social process which is already objectively present or, quote, develops, end quote. The second transformation can be brought about only by the collective subject, the proletariat itself. Marx's thought takes in all of reality as one whole. It is this developing socio-historical totality which breaks through to consciousness in Marx and has prepared the ground for awareness in the proletariat, and it is the same historical totality which understands that same historical totality self to be the, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, of the proletarian revolution. The famous sentence in the preface to Marx's Critique of Political Economy that, quote, it is not consciousness which determines being, but on the contrary, social existence which determines consciousness, end quote, is not intended to make consciousness a conditioned reflex of objective material reality, but only to combat the assertion of consciousness's independence and isolation. The class consciousness which arises from the social existence of the proletariat and which is contained as a possibility within the proletariat can therefore be transformed completely, into the social reality of the revolutionary practice. Its, quote, objective truth, end quote, is proved for the first time by this transformation into revolutionary action. The end. Thank you for listening. The next section is titled The Concept Held by Certain Ideologists of the Marxist workers' movement of the relationship between Marx and Hegel. Thank you for